there is the promotion of the idea that essentially the U.S. needs to do what China has done and replicate this civil military fusion model in order to win the AI arms race. And sort of the argument inherent in that is that in order to beat China, we must become China even more than China is. And a lot of the justifications, around China as an adversary are related to how China is not as protective of civil liberties as the United States at least postures itself as being, for example, and a major difference in the value system between China and the United States. And so if you're willing to adopt exactly that model.
So do you have the impulse to want to see AI slow down or stop?
Well, I don't necessarily want to say that I'm like a Luddite and we should all go back to the Stone Age or things like this. But I think there needs to be like an actual public discussion on this, particularly on the fact that our out of control national security state in Silicon Valley have essentially been fusing over the past few decades, and what necessarily that means. Because a lot of people will say stuff, well, it's AI in the private sector, but when that private sector company has multi-million-dollar conflicts of interest with the national security state, I think that should, be part of the discussion. Necessarily. And I think also there needs to be a way to sort of know whether some of these algorithms are hyped or whether what the company says their accuracy is, for example, is actually accurate before decisions are made to outsource major decision making, whether at the government level or the local level or really on any level, to an algorithm. So, as an example, during COVID-19, the governor of Rhode Island, Gina Raimondo, sort of gave a green light to this Israeli company called Diagnostics Robotics to use, the health data in the state to predict COVID-19 outbreaks before they could happen, right? And Gina Raimondo, by the way,
violate HIPAA laws?
Well, I'm sure a lot of those were sort of suspended under the emergency justification of COVID-19, but I'm not exactly familiar with the legal or potential legal snafus of that at the time, or maybe they justified it by alleged, saying they sort of took anonymized the data. I don't really know. But the idea was to sort of use that data to identify local hotspots and predict outbreaks before they happen. And so obviously, if, the algorithm of this company predicts an outbreak, there would be sort of these localized lockdowns and people would lose their ability to engage in in-person commerce and freedom of movement, et cetera. So, consequences that are pretty significant to the people living there. And when I reported on at the time, as I recall, but it's been a few years, but I do know that the algorithm per the company was under 80% accurate. I think it was somewhere in the 70s. And so that's the company, right? So if it's not independently vetted.
This opening segment is what made me actually check my own assumptions. Whitney says she's not anti-innovation. She's saying public discussion has to happen, especially because Silicon Valley and the national security state have been fusing for decades. When private companies have multi-million-dollar conflicts of interest with intelligence, that has to be part of the conversation. And then she drops a real-world example. Israel's Diagnostics Robotics deployed in Rhode Island during COVID, using state health data to predict outbreaks, under 80% accurate, decisions about local lockdowns, in-person commerce, freedom of movement, all driven by a company PR stat that nobody independently vetted. That's the precedent already in motion.
This is sort of, company PR at the end of the day. Is that overinflated? It's quite possible, right? And so what if the accuracy of that isn't really in the 70s, it's in the 60s or near the 50s? It's no better than a coin toss, right? Is it really worth putting that kind of power in the hand of an algorithm that isn't necessarily going to be more efficient and accurate, but all this hype that's been generated around AI as an industry suggests that has sort of created this public perception that AI is inherently smarter than human decision makers and more efficient and more cost effective, for example. I think these are kind of problematic scenarios that need to be considered. I'm not trying to be a Debbie Downer or poo-poo on on innovation, but I think, civil liberties do matter. And I think people need to be very mindful of that, especially considering, again, the Silicon Valley fusion with the national security state and the national security state's tendency to opportunistically whittle down American civil liberties for their benefit.
It's a really interesting intersection that I clearly need to start thinking more about. The way that I would look at that, and this ties into something you mentioned earlier, during the inauguration of Donald Trump, you had all these tech billionaires there by him, and it certainly gave me like, ooh, this is why people are paranoid about oligarchy vibes. And I'm not super prone to that kind of thinking. So the fact that it hit me like that, I was like, okay, definitely it's good that people are being paranoid. But the intersection feels like it's a very natural intersection to me. So the reason that national security would be fusing with technology is that technology is going to be the front where these battles are fought. And so anybody that's seen, however many thousands of drones that China can launch and get to, dance like a dragon is very compelling when you see it. It looks so cool. And then you imagine, well, what happens when 10,000 drones like that are able to go over aircraft carrier, and each one drops a reasonable sized payload that by itself would do next to nothing, but you drop 10,000 of those little somethings on that ship and you turn it into Swiss cheese.
This middle section gives me cold sweats. She doesn't pull punches. Silicon Valley plus NS state fusion has already been opportunistically whittling civil liberties for years. And Whitney reframes a scary thought. AI hype has created a public perception that bots are inherently smarter than human decision makers. That's bogus at subcoin-toss accuracy. Then the geopolitical reality check. Thousands of cheap drones. 10,000 can turn an aircraft carrier into Swiss cheese. That's why national security has to fuse with tech. But the question becomes, at what cost to civil liberties?
You realize, the way that we've been doing national defense is not going to work in a modern combat scenario. And so it is going to be these tech guys that we're going to need, even if you just grant me that AI is going to get really good at hacking, which there was a recent announcement. I forget if it was from DeepSeek. I can't remember, but there was a company that was doing this where they wanted to see how well their AI was at hacking, and it was unbelievably good. And so they were doing it as a red team inside of a company, so they can say, okay, here's how we broke our own systems. Now we need a blue team that can come in and shore these up. But you're going to have that. Like, if you are living in a world where one country has AI and another does not, the country without it will lose. And so to me, this feels like an arms race we cannot afford to not engage in. And so it just becomes a question of, all right, well, given the stakes, how do we actually navigate this? So I would not want to pull apart the national security apparatus from the tech bros to be dismissive. So what do you do? I don't know if you want to stay in the lane of like, I just want people looking at the right things, or if you actually have an insight there, but I'd be very curious.
I do prefer to stay in my lane as much as possible, frankly, especially on sort of these stickier issues, but I do have some opinions. So first of all, as I referred to earlier with the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence and some of these FOIA documents that came out of there is the promotion of the idea that essentially the U.S. needs to do what China has done and replicate this civil military fusion model.
What hits me in this segment is Whitney saying the quiet part out loud. The National Security Commission on AI, actual U.S. policy document, literally recommends we replicate China's civil-military fusion model to win the AI race. The argument is, beat China by becoming China. Even more fascist. She frames civil-military fusion as basically not different from fascism, corporatist model, then asks the question Americans should be screaming about: what if we surrender the value system that supposedly makes us the freer, better society just to win an arms race?
In order to win the AI arms race. And sort of the argument inherent in that is that in order to beat China, we must become China even more than China is. And a lot of the justifications, around China as an adversary are related to how China is not as protective of civil liberties as the United States at least postures itself as being, for example, and a major difference in the value system between China and the United States. And so if you're willing to adopt exactly that model, civil military fusion, in my opinion, is really not that different than fascism at the end of the day. It's the corporatist model, and I don't think it's necessarily what Americans want. And yeah, there is a trade-off, and I think people should consider it. But again, I'm not in the business of telling people what to think. But what happens if we go so far out of a desperation to win an AI arms race with China, for example, that we completely surrender the value system that supposedly makes us a freer, better society in the process? I think that is complicated. And I would also point to the fact that, transnational capital, a lot of that has enabled China's AI arms race. There is a lot of cross-pollination in these, Chinese government adjacent tech corporations and the United States. You can look at people like Larry Fink, for example, who definitely have a lot of ties to Chinese industry, for example, and people like Steve Schwarzman, quite similarly, very much tied there, who's, head of Blackstone. And they're both very close personal friends of Donald Trump. And also, of course, Fink has ties to the Democrats.
This is where my mind went. The framing is bipartisan by design. Whitney shows Larry Ellison and Steve Schwarzman both tied to Chinese industry plus, both close personal friends of Trump. Same fragment, different political lanes. Blackstone plus Oracle equals same capital flow, two different PAC checkboxes. So when the AI civil-military fusion debate stays a Democrat versus Republican headline, the actual players, Ellison, Schwarzman, transnational capital, operate above both parties. Your vote doesn't touch them. The value system sellout happens regardless of who's in office. That's why the public discussion Whitney's asking for is the only leverage ordinary people have left.